Welcome everyone to this CARG Colloquium. This is CARG's third kind of virtual event of the semester. If you haven't checked our website, our events page on our website, we have a full program of events for this semester and next semester, including a symposium in the spring that's organized by our fellows, which promises to be very exciting. So, watch this space. Another quick announcement before we get started with today's talk. Our annual call for postdoctoral fellows is up on our website since yesterday. So this is for a postdoctoral fellowship at CARG. The deadline for application is February 1st. So if you're looking for a postdoctoral fellowship, or if you know anyone that's in that space right now, please send them to our website, and we'll put the link in the chat right now. But more importantly for today, we're delighted, we're excited and very happy to have Maria Repnikova here with us for a talk entitled The Fragmented Spectacle of Chinese Soft Power in Africa. Maria is Assistant Professor of Global Communication at Georgia State University. She's a scholar of China, focusing on political communication, critical journalism, and propaganda. Most recently, her work has focused on China's soft power campaigns in Africa, which is the topic of today's talk. Dr. Repnikova is the author of Media Politics in China, Improvising Power Under Authoritarianism, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. The book won the Best Book of the Year prize from the International Journal of Press and Politics in 2019. Her work has appeared in New Media and Society, Journalism, China Quarterly, Comparative Politics, amongst other top-rated journals. In addition to her research on China, Maria has written widely on journalism and censorship in China and Russia in outlets such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy. She holds a doctorate in politics from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. She was also in 2014 one of the first CARG postdoctoral fellows here, I think maybe the second here. So we're in that sense happy to welcoming her back to CARG. And she's spending this year at the Wilson Center as a 2020-2021 Wilson Fellow. Just a couple of just practical things before we get started with the talk. Maria will talk for about 35-40 minutes. We ask you to stay muted during that time. The chat is open, and we ask you to use the chat function to post your questions, which Maria will take, in order that they come after the talk. If you are on Twitter and tweeting about the event, please do so, and please use our hashtag, which is CARG2021, and we'll put that in the chat too. Okay, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Maria Repnikova to this virtual stage.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yeah, oh, great. So it's a real pleasure and honor to be back at CARG and at the Annenberg community at large. It's a space and community that has really inspired my research and teaching in global communication when I was a postdoc fellow there already 5 years ago. Today, as Clovis has mentioned, I'm reporting from Wilson Center. We're still open despite the circumstances, and I'm working here on 2 book projects this year, one on China's global soft power, which is the state of the field book I'm submitting to Cambridge next month. And the second project that I'm speaking about today is an ethnographic account of China's soft power in Africa, and that's the subject of today's talk. So this talk covers a very broad ground. I'm going to begin with, let's see, oh, sorry, there's a bit of a trouble moving the slides, one moment. Okay, looks like it's fine. Sorry about that. So the talk will begin with a history of the concept of soft power, how it traveled from the US to China to Africa. And we'll continue to discuss the analytical and methodological approach of the book and the key findings, of course, especially focusing on China's soft power in Ethiopia, concluding with some implications of what it tells us how we should think about US cultural hegemony, China's form of cultural globalization, as well as the global South. But before starting to merge straight into the topic of the idea of soft power, I wanted to briefly take you to one side of routine cultural encounter between China and Ethiopia. This site is a trade fair that takes place annually at Addis Ababa, the capital city of Ethiopia, every year in early March that I've attended now, sorry, in May that I've attended now 2 years in a row. It brings together individuals from all over the city and the country of Ethiopia to meet Chinese traders and learn about things like noodle making machines. This fair also attracts, as you see, long lines of people partaking in this event, but it also carries an interesting diplomatic component. There are officials traveling from China to Ethiopia to talk about China-Ethiopia relations and to talk about the diplomatic aspect of it. At this specific event, there were officials speaking from the province of Hunan that occupied the space here. And very quickly into this talk, just about a minute into it, it was very clear that the talk was more about China than about Ethiopia. The officials started by saying that Ethiopia is a beautiful country, but then went on to talk about Hunan in detailed and very quantified manner. For example, Hunan has a square footage of 212,800 square feet. It has 73 million people, 18 national scientific labs, and so forth and so on. It was overwhelming to listen to the speech for about 45 minutes. The next speaker started out by saying that he's happy to visit a civilized African country. Without unpacking this very problematic statement, he again went on to talk about Hunan, his home province. The event concluded abruptly as participants and the people who gathered started to look quite bored, fidgeting with their phones and waiting to leave. Hunan officials welcomed everyone to continue on to a ceremony of matchmaking, kind of cultural, but also trade deals. And as they themselves went upstairs to a restaurant where they sat around the round table, eating Chinese food, just like they would in Hunan. To me, this very mundane interaction really captures what I study or look at as Chinese kind of contradictory form of soft power that I describe as fragmented spectacle. We see China is managing to attract a lot of people because of the open access of this event, but also the trade deals, the kind of economic benefits that they lure in the participants with to listen to this diplomatic speech. But at the same time, we also see that this event is quite awkward. The two participants, the two groups are not interacting. They're sitting in the same space, but exist in parallel worlds. China appears to speak at Ethiopia rather than with Ethiopians. It is this kind of encounters that I cover in my research, and I will talk about in more detail throughout this presentation. But I want to first conceptualize and highlight the key idea of this talk and the key concept of the title as well, the fragmented spectacle, which has two components to it. The first is the spectacular. It's seduction through exuberant generosity and scale that China really, that's how China really manages to attract participants to its project. But it's also fragmented as it yields ambivalent and contested Sino-African solidarities. So before delving deeper into the China-Africa story, I want to step back briefly and walk us through the idea of soft power, its historic trajectory, and how it managed to make it to China in the first place. So first of all, the concept of soft power was coined by Joseph Nye, a professor and an official in 1990, as a way to kind of rebuke the idea of US global decline, the idea of imperial overstretch that some were claiming right before the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War has ended. He noted this notion of attraction through values, through foreign policy, through culture, that is kind of an untapped resource of the United States. Post 9/11 and the Iraq War, he once again stresses soft power, this time as a reputation management tool in the Middle East. In 2003, he introduces yet another concept that's even more ambiguous, smart power, combining hard and soft. Very hard to understand how to really use that, given that it's so broad. But because of the fluidity of this concept, it actually managed to make it across borders to many other countries, including the key geopolitical rivals of the United States, Turkey, Iran, Russia, and China, as these countries managed to adopt in their own, reinvent the concept of soft power. China in particular has been obsessively studying and using soft power since mid-2000s. We see this in several ways. First of all, the invention of new terms such as cultural soft power, 文化软实力, the discourse power, the right to speak in the international system, 话语权, big country image, 大国形象, all of them are kind of the synonyms or sort of the symbiotic concepts around soft power. There are thousands of academic articles written on this topic. And of course, it's also backed up with money. The initiative of soft power that includes media reach, education opportunities, scholarships, various types of cultural endeavors are estimated at $10 billion a year. This number is hard to verify because Chinese system is so decentralized. So it's hard to know that that's the exact number, but that's what The Economist and several scholars cite as the number of Chinese, the investment of Chinese party state into soft power. This compares to only about 2.9 billion spent by the United States, the number that stayed fairly stable over the past 10 years. The reaction to China's endeavor of attraction or yielding attraction around the world has been met with suspicion, disregard, and also deep concern in the community in the United States, but also more broadly around in the West. The first reaction is that China cannot buy love. China is uncool. Why is it uncool? It's because of its authoritarian political system. It can never really overcome its image as an authoritarian party state, despite the money that it's spending. But the second reaction really echoes the rhetoric from the Cold War. The idea that China is a moral contestant or some form of an ideological enemy. We see the Defense Department in the past 2 years shifting a lot of money from fighting terrorism to fighting China's and Russia's global influence. We also see publications like the New Yorker, a liberal publication that urges the United States to engage in a contest for moral vision with China. This contestation for values and global leadership is especially poignant and sensitive in the context of Africa, the continent that has served as a moral theater for geopolitical competition across various powers during the Cold War, United States, Soviet Union, and China. In recent years, we see a reemergence of this competition with rhetoric around neocolonialism, new colonialism, but also ideological brainwashing, digital surveillance authoritarianism, export of Chinese model. All of that is dominating policy reports, academic writings in international relations, but also a lot of the media articles and official statements. In contrast to these provocative statements that are quite contentious, we also see global communication scholarship has long engaged with the foundations and fragilities of US cultural hegemony, drawing on cases from the global South to explore different forms of resistance, including that through being an active audience, but also through the formation of new media cultural production hubs. India, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria all come to mind as some of these case studies. China in particular has been described by a communication scholar Thuso as having a potential to create a counterflow to US hegemony in places like Africa because of its immense investments in public diplomacy and media. But these binary visions that portray China as either a neo-colonial aggressor or a counter-hegemonic ally really miss the kind of messiness and the realities of China's soft power on the ground. Responding to the call from communication scholar Willems that really tells us to engage in grounded theory from the global South, to treat it in its own right. I treat soft power, including the different practices that it entails, how they're conceived, received, negotiated, in their own right from the Chinese and the Ethiopian perspective in this case. I'm very interested in the how of soft power as opposed to the what. The what has been explored by IR scholars as a series of assets, as well as strategic narratives when it comes to communication scholarship. I'm treating soft power as an interactive policy process or a form of cultural encounter, borrowing on the anthropology of IR literature here. And while there have been a number of studies that have written about journalism and media engagements in South Africa, and especially in Kenya, that are coming from China and what sort of communication initiatives they entail, this manuscript is the first one to present a more holistic picture of China's soft power engagements in 3 ways. First, China's outreach to elites. Second, China's outreach to the youth. And third, China's outreach to the larger public. Specifically, I look at official trainings, the elite trainings. China is now the #1 opportunity for African officials to essentially see the world, to get a new perspective. 50,000 new opportunities were pledged by President Xi in 2018. There are now 62 Confucius Institutes across the African continent. They're similar to Alliance Française or American Corners that teach Chinese language and culture, and also invite students for scholarships to travel to China. And of course, media endeavors that cannot be ignored, with major state-sponsored media hubs set up in Nairobi, but reaching out throughout the continent, including in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I carry out this research through fieldwork and ethnographic fieldwork across several contexts, specifically between China, Ethiopia, and the United States. And I pick Ethiopia here in particular because I see it as a really fascinating path-breaking case to examine the extent of the possibility of China's soft power influence. I would argue that if it were to work anywhere in Africa, but maybe even broadly in the global South, it would be Ethiopia because of its extremely close relationship, multifaceted relationship with China. Ethiopia is one of China's most robust economic partners. It's the 2nd biggest loan recipient. It has attracted 700 Chinese companies to the country. It's also a political partner with party-to-party relations developing smoothly over the years. And of course, very importantly, Ethiopia is a diplomatic hub. It hosts the African Union and presents a channel or a pathway for China to reach out to the rest of the continent. Under the current Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, there's also been a shift towards the United States in Ethiopia, which presents a little bit of a test or friction when it comes to Sino-Ethiopia relations. It's really obvious that Ethiopia and China ties are present at every level of society. When you exit the airport, for example, in Addis Ababa, the first sign you see is this. It's a bit of an awkward translation here, but this is essentially a Chinese company putting up a sign because they are the ones building the airport. As you walk out the airport, you'll see Chinese workers, and you walk further, you spot a small Chinatown that's really almost next to the airport. So it's really kind of fascinating just how aesthetically, but also physically present China is, as well as, of course, at the economic, diplomatic, and political level. When I look at this relationship and in terms of its soft power and culture reach, I specifically focus on my research on qualitative interviews, as well as participant observations and textual analysis. Specifically, I've carried out over 100 interviews across Ethiopia, China, United States, and Russia for a comparative perspective, looking at teachers, officials, but also lay citizens who are engaged with China in some form, either by riding a Chinese train or consuming Chinese products. All kinds of conversations that take place on a daily basis, surprisingly, often concern China. On the Chinese side, I look at trainers, professionals, experts, people who are thinking about Africa from the elite level to the level of merchants and consumers who travel frequently to Africa as tourists, as students, and so forth. And in the United States, I also look at officials who are trying to theorize, but also think about what does this mean for the United States, with China's growing influence in Africa. I combined this with participant observations of trade fairs, attending various events, including setting up my own events, workshops across Ethiopian institutions to talk about China. I've traveled across the country to give lectures and to inspire a conversation and debate. And questions that came up were really fascinating, critical, and multifaceted, and informed a lot of my research about how to present these ideas and how to continue to carry out the project. I've also looked at textual materials, including training materials themselves that have been shared by Ethiopian elites, Chinese materials, and of course also media articles that were published about China and Ethiopia and about Africa by Chinese media. These are just some visuals of Chinese office there, look a little bit run down, but on the right side, you see an American corner, a tiny library in the center of the city in Bahar Dar that's quite small and almost invisible, with Chinese offices in contrast being located right on central campuses. So returning to this idea of fragmented spectacle that I've introduced to you earlier in the talk, I want to highlight a bit more detail of what does this actually entail. So what I'm going to talk about further is this soft power appeal of scale and exuberant generosity that's at the heart of China's image in Africa, but also at the heart of its attempt to formulate its soft power initiative as differently from the United States. But what it yields are solidarities that are quite ambivalent and contested, and that take place in three forms that are conceptualized as performative, material, and discursive. Performative when it comes to trainings, material when it comes to Confucius Institutes, and discursive when it comes to the media. So I'm going to first explain a little bit more about the scale and the attraction, the spectacle itself, and then the types of solidarities that it yields on the ground. So first of all, when it comes to scale, I already mentioned just the numbers, right? The opportunities are extremely accessible, but it's important to also note that the rhetoric of the Chinese government with regards to soft power, but foreign policy vis-a-vis Africa in general, stresses ideas like mutuality, win-win, and generosity. It's kind of being at the heart of its positioning vis-a-vis Africa. In essence, it's a lot less ideological and a lot more practical than the US initiatives that have stuck to the same strategy of promoting their values and ideals of democracy since the Cold War. China, in contrast, makes itself readily accessible. To give you an example from trainings, a journalist from Ethiopia's news agency, the major news agency located in Addis Ababa, goes in for an interview to a Chinese embassy to get his materials approved for yet another training experience for the second time. The questions he's asked are quite comical. Do you like China? Have you been to China? Do you speak a little bit of English? He pulls out a photograph of Mao Zedong's home village located outside of Changsha city in Hunan and says, I love China, I want to go to China. He played up this enthusiasm and immediately got his paperwork back. This, of course, is a comical vignette, but it's kind of, I think, captures the ease of some of these interviews. They're very quick and a little bit ad hoc, but not nearly as extensive as something that you would experience if you were going to Europe or the United States. Confucius Institutes, once again, China's cultural institutes that are teaching Chinese language, are open to any student or faculty for free. There's no fee associated with those institutes. Anybody who works for a Chinese company, from farmers to chauffeurs to chefs to drivers, is able to attend a Chinese class for a very small fee. This compares to relatively inaffordable classes of French in Alliance Française or German, right, where you have to really commit your resources to studying those languages. When it comes to media, you can literally see it flooding physical spaces in Addis Ababa and other cities. If you enter an international hotel, the only free newspaper you'll get is from China, China Daily. And of course, it's a little bit suspicious that nobody's taking it. It seems to be a little bit too full, but it is delivered to major institutions, to university presidents, to media outlets. And until recently, it was also put in as kind of a side within an Ethiopian paper. So people could read an Ethiopian paper and then suddenly they see China Daily popping out of nowhere for them to read if they desire to do so. So there's this idea of kind of flooding opportunities and making oneself readily accessible. But again, the kind of friendships, affinities that it heals are much more complicated than it might come out from the kind of the first view. We might assume that it's working perfectly, but in fact, it's not. So shifting to the first form of solidarity that I want to cover here is performative solidarity that speaks to the trainings of Ethiopian elites and officials coming to China. A lot of literature has been published recently about China exporting its authoritarian model. My research finds that this is not the case. What China is actually trying to do is show off itself as this magnificent developmental miracle, but not so much to teach or to export a particular set of values, ideas, or practices. In particular, Chinese officials stress this notion of experiencing China, Diyan Zhongguo. The physical experience itself is supposed to yield respect and inspiration. Ethiopian participants in turn reciprocate with gratitude and public endorsements of solidarity. In practice, this means that Ethiopian officials who arrive at the airport are greeted with dozens of volunteers carrying the red flags as well as their name tags, taking them to five-star hotels and immediately to banquets where they're given fancy Chinese delicacies and invited to celebrate China-Africa friendship. They're also taken around various sites all across China, mostly the most successful sites, meaning the fast-speed rail, the major company headquarters, the historic relics, but not so much, of course, the underdeveloped rural areas. And they're overflooded with images like this, taken directly from training materials that were shared with me by Ethiopian officials. It's all full of numbers, and the numbers are indicating China's growth and success. So we just see, from 1982, it was this much, and then in 2006, it's exponentially bigger. So the notion is to really show off China in every way. When journalists come for these trainings, they're not told how to censor the media or how to practice propaganda. They're taught that Chinese media is globally successful and that it's transitioning very effectively online into the digital space, unlike Western media. So again, it's a show as opposed to the actual practice of how to incorporate China's ideas. There's very little of it that relates directly to Africa. Specifically, but at the same time, officials who barely remember any of these numbers, of course, they do remember the spectacle of China's economic success when they return to Ethiopia. In return, and in addition to kind of just accepting these trainings, I see Ethiopian participants and African elites more broadly as co-creating the spectacle. Here you see an example of this co-creation with an interview I managed to record when I was attending a China-Africa trade fair, this time in Hunan province itself last summer. There was an interview on Chinese television station with Tanzanian foreign minister. The host asked him about the frictions incurred from China with regards to debt trap diplomacy. Are you feeling burdened by debt that comes with our loans, essentially? The response is, we have no frictions. The interviewer continues, but Western media, and he interrupts her and says, it's very good, you're saying it's Reuters. It's not the first time China is accused by such publications. Such examples, don't capture the unique special relationship between Tanzania and China. This is exactly the kind of interview you see all over Chinese media, and it's the message that gets transmitted globally as well as to Chinese audiences. So there's this idea of co-creating this spectacle also in a mediatized way with participants giving interviews and very, very positive reflections about their experience, but about China-Africa relations at large. When they give feedback, written feedback, and fill out forms and surveys, Chinese hosts tell me they never see a single number that's below 100%. So they always say that the experience was exactly 100% successful. Chinese hosts tell me they don't believe a single number they see from their African participants because, why would they always put consistently 100%? So they turn to me and ask me, what do they really think about us? The question I chose not to answer and diplomatically exit the stage. But beneath this kind of theater curtain of a spectacle of these trainings, we also see some tensions between what some scholars describe as staged authenticity and spontaneous encounters with China. One such tension is an encounter with China's censorship and its authoritarian system. Specifically, Ethiopian elites recall asking uncomfortable questions in these lectures that were left unanswered. One official asked about the environmental impact of Chinese companies in Ethiopia. The response he got, "Are you from the United States?" It was quite an angry reaction. His response followed with, "No, I'm from Ethiopia and I want to know the answer." He was met with silence. He turns to me and says, "Chinese culture, it's very closed." So the reaction was kind of to mold this idea of censorship into the overall perception of Chinese culture. The second type of encounter here is with lay Chinese citizens that kind of don't fit under the theatrical curtain. These are the people you encounter at the subway station, right? In the trade fair that are waiting to get in. These are the people you might see at a restaurant, the waiter, somebody who serves you at the hotel. And here, Ethiopian citizens and Africans at large are met with a mixture of exoticism, whereby they're being taken pictures of without any permission. Sometimes their hair is touched, sometimes their clothing is touched by Chinese citizens who meet them, photographs and so forth, but also stereotypes about AIDS, about the color of their skin, and sometimes just plain avoidance of Ethiopians and Africans just not being in the same space with them, exiting an elevator, exiting a public transport, and so forth. This reaction is described to me with some humor and also the association with ignorance, that China, while it presents itself to be so open, so global, and so generous, is actually filled with citizens who are not open to the world. They don't know much about Africa, not to mention specific African countries, and they're not that curious to know more beyond the photographs. And I'm happy to talk more about this interpretation of racism and racial encounters also in the Q&A. Shifting now to a different kind of encounter that takes us to the material solidarity, which also is a fascinating form of interaction that carries its own tensions. Here we see that China seduces students as well as deans and officials at universities with the offerings of jobs at Chinese companies. And the teachers themselves who come from China are primarily treating it as a site of professional experience, rather than as some kind of a adventure or some sort of an idealistic experience or just a point of curiosity. As a result, there's also this tension between affinity and transactional relations. It's kind of hard to discern the two from one another. So when you enter a typical Confucius Institute here, you see a poster, very, packed poster, once again, that seems to be a feature of some of this Chinese science. Some of it is filled with mistakes, but the key point here is that the poster explains why you should study Chinese. And the first point here is that there are many Chinese companies investing in Ethiopia. The message is that if you learn Chinese, you can become a translator for one of these companies. And that's a really exciting opportunity for many students with almost a 30% unemployment rate, for the youth who can get paid 2 to 3 times the rate of the professor at their own university as a translator for Chinese firms. So it's a very seductive message. And of course, many students are aware of the presence of Chinese companies because of the types of buildings they see all across major Ethiopian cities that are constructed by China. So they know that there's this major community and they're aware that their language skills might be useful. In practice, beyond just advertising jobs, Chinese teachers integrate kind of the material into the cultural aspects of their teachings. For example, Chinese companies are invited into cultural events. They're invited to promote China. They're invited on campus. Students are taken to the headquarters of Chinese firms. Confucius Institutes arrange interviews right in their own spaces. They sort of serve as employment centers in some cases. And they also train students in skills like punctuality and the use of technology like WeChat to be able to communicate readily with their Chinese bosses and colleagues. When we turn to teachers themselves, or why they come to Ethiopia, teachers are often ignored and in the study of Confucius Institutes because they're sort of seen as, again, kind of the agents of propaganda. They're not. A lot of them are coming here because they want to practice their skills as an English speaker, but also their skills of teaching Chinese as a foreign language. That's their major. So when they come to Ethiopia, they see it as interchangeable destination. They could have gone elsewhere, but their university has a contract with Ethiopia. It's a university-based kind of contract system. So they end up following their teachers to this particular country. When you ask them, would you rather go elsewhere? The answer is sure. I would go elsewhere and wouldn't even hesitate. There's very little commitment to the specific space. And when they're trained, before leaving China to go to Africa, the training is almost comical and very limited. They're giving a little bit of cultural information, but most of them come with almost no skills that prepares them for life in Ethiopia, not to mention any basic language skills. So when we think about this kind of, motivations with teachers coming in to practice their skills, and the skills, by the way, that they hope will eventually take them not to other African countries, but to the United States. Most of them dream of coming to the US or Western Europe as teachers, as opposed to coming back again to Africa. So this creates kind of this interesting relationship that on the one hand brings together Ethiopian administrators, students, and teachers into these centers to learn Chinese, to teach Chinese, to get jobs. But at the same time, there's also very little kind of deeper cultural affinity that's forming here. The teachers that I've met have created almost no relationships with local communities, whether it's other students or even other Chinese schools. There are some other schools that have been opened up by former students that have tried to create contact with Confucius Institutes, but they were really met with kind of a relatively cold response. At the same time, we also see on the Ethiopian side the sense of the getting most out of the narrative. A lot of the deans talk to me about wanting more resources from China. So this time they gave us this many jobs, but next year we want more jobs, more scholarships, a new building. Otherwise, we can easily shut this down. When I asked the deans what would happen if the job market were to saturate, at some point the companies may leave, they may have enough translators, they might learn Amharic on their own. The answer is very simple: we'll close them. There's absolutely no hesitation. If there's no jobs, there are no opportunities, these cultural centers will cease to exist. So this again speaks to kind of the strong appeal of the material offerings, but also its significant limitations, as it doesn't really facilitate deeper ties or interactions. The final form of solidarity that I want to touch upon here today is the discursive solidarity that speaks to media ties. Specifically here, I want to talk about Chinese media as presenting itself as empowering a more positive narrative about Africa. So it's not just about telling the China-Africa story, but they position themselves as telling a more positive story of Africa to the world. I describe it as discursive empowerment. You see this in some of these titles here. On the left, you see Xinhua News Agency, China's major news agency, and CGTN writing relatively positive stories about China-Africa cooperation, about Nigeria's Buhari welcoming vaccine progress. There's a sense of hope that they try to transmit. On the right side, you see BBC News and Bloomberg with a much more gloomy insights about the lack of COVID testing, about poverty rates, and so forth. China is explicitly trying to be different. It's a different story about Africa that it's trying to tell. Ethiopian editor of Xinhua News Agency that works with the Chinese boss, who he introduced me to, told me that the Chinese boss essentially sees his role in Ethiopia in this kind of developmental modernization kind of narrative way, that we are here to modernize Ethiopia. I asked him what that means, and he said the whole idea is to essentially write positive stories, tell a positive story about Ethiopia, make it look attractive, and as a result, bring in more money from the world. So he thinks that by writing the stories, he's going to create some kind of a influx of aid or more developmental help for this country. He gives me an example of the head of Xinhua News Agency from Beijing. It's a huge news agency. The director is a very powerful person. He travels to Russia to meet his counterparts. And the Russian counterpart says, guess where I get my news about Africa? From Xinhua News Agency. So there was this kind of pride that there's this flows of information that are bypassing the West and going straight to Russia, with the Russians learning about Africa from them. But I'm not sure if it yields any particular new programs, projects, or new aid initiatives as far as I know. When we look at the Ethiopian side of this equation, Ethiopian elites welcome this much more positive projection of China, but also China, Africa, and of course, Africa itself. Some officials tell me Chinese media makes us look good. Even though they might not read it very carefully, or they might not subscribe to it that much, they see it as kind of a positive image boosting function. In turn, Ethiopian media largely write only positive stories about China. I've researched Ethiopian media coverage about China over the past 10 years, and I found not a single in-depth investigative story, but only a few negative stories concerning tax fraud and a few corruption cases that were already under legal investigation. Most titles will follow something like you see on the left. Ethiopia and China agree to strengthen cooperation, and so forth. And you see something like this on the right, which is one of the most controversial articles I actually found in private media called Fortune. It's called The Chinese Conundrum. And I tracked down the author and had coffee with him. And I asked him, what was his original kind of intent with this piece, which was quite critical of China. He said his original title was The Chinese Neocolonialism. But the editor snapped neocolonialism for conundrum to make it sound a little bit more ambivalent and perhaps a little bit more neutral. There was awareness of a degree of self-censorship that Ethiopian journalists talk about with regards to China. As some of them said, smiling, that you can say anything you want about China as long as it's positive. So it's pretty clear what kind of stories are expected to come out of these news outlets. And China watches very closely what Ethiopian media publish about it. So as soon as there's a small crisis, a negative report, they actually track down the journalists, come to the news office and have a conversation with them. So they're really closely watching every single article that mentions China. Again, if we step behind this discursive solidarity into the world of social media and popular culture, we see a somewhat different picture that's much more ridden with tensions. Here you see two examples of what I would call perhaps subtle, but maybe not so subtle critique of China. On the left side, I see this as a more subtle message that speaks to the trade fair event that I started, I opened this presentation with. Essentially, this author, this journalist says that the trade fair is supposed to change the misconception that China only produces low quality products. So rather than saying the trade fair brings us opportunities, the whole point is that it's supposed to change the negative perceptions of China in Ethiopia. And in fact, the idea of low quality is one of the key kind of memes and themes that comes up in almost every conversation. I get asked questions about why did the shoe that I bought, was set on fire? I mean, it sounds pretty crazy, but people talk about things literally collapsing on them as they're walking, the shoe falls apart. The bridges are broken, the roads won't last. Even though there's sometimes little evidence for some of these claims, the assumption is that everything that comes here from China is not of high quality, that they're being flooded with products that are almost unwanted, undesired, or they're seen as undesired because they're giving lower quality products. On the right, of course, you see much more direct critique of this kind of China-Africa relationship, with China carrying out Africa as kind of a natural resource, essentially, Xi Jinping in the background, sneaking out the resources, and African officials celebrating with their $60 billion deals. And that, of course, is also a very common critique that critiques both corruption of African officials as well as China's incurring influence that they see as, in some ways, as neo-colonial. But beneath this kind of layer of social media, it's also important to look at popular encounters, the kind of popular culture which doesn't really often get captured in social media or perhaps in any media itself. And here I see that the two groups, broadly speaking, Chinese and in this case Ethiopians, they see each other through this very much racial cultural stereotypes. When it comes to how Chinese are seen by Ethiopians, the three kind of memes or terms that come to mind is heartless, predatory, and robotic. And one particular rumor I think really captures this sort of features is that Chinese companies bring prison labor to Africa. I've been asked about this every single time. Why are they bringing prison labor? There's no evidence for this rumor as far as I know. And Chinese constantly deny it, but the rumor continues to really kind of flourish and actually become stronger over time. Here it also shows Chinese workers are seen as robotic. They're working all the time. How could anybody work all the time? They have to be a prisoner. It's predatory because they're not hiring local labor, according to this perception. And they're heartless because they're bringing prison laborers to another country and making them suffer there. So there's kind of the sense of really quite a desperate, but also pretty gloomy sort of vision of what Chinese people are like. That's what they see through their prism. When it comes to the visions of Africans, or in this case, specifically Ethiopians, that I've encountered in my conversations with Chinese teachers, laborers, all kinds of people who inhabit the spaces, three different tropes come to mind: lazy, backwards and low quality, and exotic. These are the kind of words that come to mind. And it's important here to note that the history of race in China is traced back to the 19th century, and consistently Africans have been portrayed as kind of at the lowest place in the hierarchy of races, with a brief exception of the Mao era. But in contemporary China, what we see is this interesting fusion of using concepts like backwards, low quality, suzhi, this idea that's often applied to peasants within China who happen to be darker skinned and underdeveloped. The same kind of trope is applied to Africans. So they're using their own terms, their own ways to conceptualize, to think about how to categorize, how to think about Africans, but at the same time also importing some stereotypes from the West about the kind of sexualized identities of their African friends, and sort of trying to really focus on their exotic features, exaggerating them profusely in various conversations, jokes, and interactions. So this brings me to the very final thoughts I want to share with this presentation. First of all, I want to kind of restate again the key idea behind this book that's very much still in development, this notion of a fragmented spectacle of China's soft power. I think it really stands in a position to, the kind of conceptions we often see in popular reporting and international relations literature about this notion of moral adversary, or China is this kind of clear adversary, as well as China is kind of a more hopeful sort of counter-hegemonic force. I think Fragmented Spectacles shows that it's neither of those things. It's neither a very clear, explicit adversary, nor is it some kind of a hopeful sort of force that fuses together these different communities in the global South. Instead, what we see is that China practices a very kind of distorted but quite grand form of soft power. It lures people in with its seductive offerings, but it also ends up inciting the types of solidarities that are really ridden with quite a lot of tension, specifically between the levels of elites and popular culture. We see a lot of disconnect between how elites interact and how common people interact with one another. It's a very different story. And I want to offer a few thoughts in terms of what we should take away from this when it comes to Sino-globalization, US culture hegemony, and global South. When it comes to Sino-globalization, I think what we see here is that China's soft power approach is quite distinctive from that of the United States and also Russia that I studied in my research, but didn't get to talk about here. What is the distinction? Well, we see that China's approach of this fusing material and cultural offerings is different from the more ideological, kind of ideas-driven approach, quite rigid approach of the United States. It still stresses values at all costs and invests quite little into its appearances or into its offerings on the ground. We also see Russia as focusing on nostalgia, on the past, on the history of Soviet Union in Ethiopia and in Africa at large as being the key kind of glue between these communities, but not so much about the present or the future. So every kind of narrative seems to stem back to the past. China is actually focusing a lot less on its history, despite the fact that it has a rich history with Africa under the Mao era, and more so in practice, it's focusing on the present, the empowerment in the present and in the future. So this form of Sino-globalization, I think it's different. And we also see that China has really readapted, reinterpreted, and reinvented the idea of soft power to suit its own strengths, abilities, and desires in Africa and beyond. When it comes to US cultural hegemony, highly contested topic still, I think what this shows us is that US cultural hegemony coexists with China's soft power reach. It doesn't quite stand in a position to it. Why is that the case? Well, first of all, again, unlike the Cold War era, when these two different groups, Africans and Chinese, were often fused together against the shared enemy, right, of the West and the US, in this case, this enemy is not clear. It's very ambivalent. Perhaps there is no enemy. It's more so about mutual empowerment than having a shared kind of enemy or contestant. But more importantly, I would say that the US is always present in any conversation about Ethiopia and China. It's present in their conversation itself. For instance, as I already mentioned, for Chinese teachers, but also journalists and other participants, it's the United States that's the final destination. Ethiopia and Africa is a transit point in their careers. They want to transit through there and then get appointed elsewhere. In many conversations, I was stopped when I was asking questions about Ethiopia to be asked questions myself about the United States. They were so eager to get there next than to talk about their experience in Africa. When it comes to Ethiopian participants, they often see China as a second choice. They would say, well, if you open your door, that's the metaphor they used, if you open your door wider, we would come to you. But the door is closed, so we go to China. Some of them have shared really long and emotional emails about trying to get into a graduate program in the United States, but not getting funding. And again, finding themselves in a strange provincial city in China and trying to make the best of their experience. So really, this idea of kind of shared desire for the West, and in particular the United States, I think is still part of this interaction, which shows that, again, US culture hegemony in this kind of hierarchy of desire still stands higher than China, but that might change over time. And lastly, I think we should work further to de-romanticize this idea of the global South. I think it's very appealing to treat this as this form of unity, as kind of this shared space that brings hope and possibility. But I think it's only by stepping back away from the romantic towards looking at the more mundane and tense, often contested interactions that take place between different groups in the global South, is that we can get closer towards grasping with the realities, as well as theorizing global South on its own terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria, for this fascinating talk, which I think really complicates and kind of gives real nuance to our understanding of, China's kind of relation with Africa, and also kind of thinking about kind of the global workings of soft power. Just to remind everyone to submit your questions in the chat. I see there's already questions. So I think the easiest is if you just take the questions directly, Maria.
Let me just, okay, seeing the chat.
Or do you want me to read them out in order? There's a few questions already.
So some of them are a little bit written in a long form, but I'm going to try to go quickly with them. So the first question is, do you think media exert any influence over the Sino-Ethiopian relationship? It seems that people don't buy official propaganda. They're more into social media satires, parodies, but there's a lack of in-depth critiques or reflections of either frameworks of cooperation or the cultural perceptions of the other country. So does media have any effect? I think the first question. I would say that official media has relatively superficial effect when it comes to reaching the broader public. I think what it reaches in this case are the elites who are very happy to have Ethiopia again look good in front of the world, that to kind of have it as a channel for expressing a more positive story about Ethiopia. But I don't think there's a whole lot of outreach that really dives into the wider community. And some other really interesting studies that have been published about South Africa and Kenya, they also note that even when it comes to reaching journalists, right, how do they see Chinese media, do they cite it? The responses from surveys that were done suggest that they actually barely cite Chinese media, and they often are suspicious of it because they see it as connected with propaganda and censorship. So thus far, we don't see a very powerful, I think, reaction or a very powerful effect when it comes to broader public. But at the same time, perhaps what China is looking for is this much more performative discursive solidarity than reaching the wider public at large. Their soft power enterprise, actually, the way that it's evaluated by the elites in China is not looking so much at quality, but at quantity. So if they show that they've published X amount of articles and they're cited in Ethiopian media, that gets somebody promoted more readily than by having some kind of survey that shows that 1 million people read Chinese media. So the matrix for promotion are also complicating the story, and that's something I wanted to mention in response to this question. The second question is how successfully are Chinese and pro-China media countering the death trap narrative promoted by the US administration? So first of all, they are very much sensitive to this narrative. Whenever I travel to China and I talk about this issue, it comes up, and people, sometimes the elites themselves, they would kind of start in a belligerent way by saying, well, you represent America, right? You come from the US government, and why are you doing this to us? Like, why are you accusing us of this? So the first step sometimes is actually quite an unpleasant interaction, which suggests that, you're representing this country that accuses us of something really terrible, and they tend to be very defensive about it, especially when it comes to this death trap idea. They form everything around actually using the term South-South collaboration, mutuality, win-win, the idea of help as opposed to, and shared victory as opposed to death trap. And there are scholars like Deborah Bradegam, who is based here in DC at SAIS, who has written extensively disputing this death trap diplomacy narrative with various forms of evidence. She's very welcomed in China, and her work is readily translated in Chinese language. So when they see scholars who are supporting kind of a more constructive way of thinking about it, who are critiquing this line, they endorse them and they make this message clear to Chinese and global publics. Would the Ethiopians' opinions about China differ by age or profession or other identities? Well, that's an interesting question. I think here, one thing that struck me as kind of as a cohesive glue, I guess, in terms of the ideas about China is this obsession with quality that comes with kind of China at large. No matter if you speak to elites or a worker who works for a Chinese company or somebody who works at a restaurant, they will often bring up the quality, and they make jokes about quality constantly, about the cell phones breaking down, about all kinds of things really kind of not working. An anecdote from this is a long stay at a hotel in Addis Ababa, where the television that I had in my room actually kept turning on by itself at night. It was very scary. So I called in the staff to help, and they laugh at me and say, China TV. So, this is the initial observation is this is not our fault. The TV comes from China. And the other rooms' TV come from a different country, so they're better. So the association is always, I think, taken with suspicion. But at the same time, I think the elites benefit quite a bit more. They see themselves as having this relationship be very significant, not only for Ethiopia, but also for negotiating with other major powers like the United States, like Russia. So maintaining this relationship, at least at the surface, is very significant to them. So they would never want to admit to any weaknesses, especially in public or on media. But when you take them outside of that and speak in person, the relationship is described in much more contested terms. The next question is from Ri Zhong. How has China's media like CGTN, other bureaus been processing, perceiving, reporting, and interpreting the current Ethiopian conflict given its soft power interests you've discussed? Yes, this, to be honest, I haven't followed the very detailed current coverage of the conflict that's taking place in Ethiopia with the Tigray region. But in general, when it comes to conflicts in Ethiopia, but also throughout Africa and even globally, China tends to be to take a very diplomatic position. They try not to show that they might get involved in any way. They don't support any sides. They were very close to TPLF, the branch of the EPRDF, the key governing party that is now basically at war with the Prosperity Party led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. China was very close to this northern party. And I think from what I've gathered from interviews, they're disappointed that Abiy Ahmed is turning into this, turning Ethiopia into this tense situation, but also that he's turning more to the United States. So there's this kind of inner, I think, questions that they rise amongst themselves. Maybe they also pose them to others, but I don't see them covering it in a biased way, because they really don't want to show that the allegiance is to any one side, because they want to work with Ethiopian leaders, no matter who it is. They want to stick with the winners. So that's my brief response to that. The next question is, could you speak to your interchangeable use of words, Africa and Ethiopia? In many cases, you use Africa rather than Ethiopia. And I wondered about whether the interchange was deliberate and whose view it represents. Thank you. Yeah, in this case, the interchange sometimes represented the fact that my research focused specifically on the Ethiopia case study, but I also interviewed a lot of elites, students, and other participants from various African countries in China. So when I was in China, my research went beyond Ethiopia into the broader scope. So sometimes the two blur together, but when I'm focusing specifically on Ethiopia, I tend to highlight that this is in relation to Ethiopia. But also when it comes to stereotypes or racial profiling, these kind of terms that I've described at the very end of presentation are used more broadly for Africans, not just Ethiopia. So in some case, there is actually blurry boundary. In some case, I draw only on my Ethiopia research and I specify it. But that's something that sometimes overlaps because the project has taken kind of a larger scope as I spend more time in China looking at other participants outside of Ethiopia. Let's see. Somebody says that my current research, it is Kang Yan here, he's saying that about his research is about the role of authoritarian regimes on journalism in the transformation of China's social context. There is paradoxical, on the one hand, China takes more control of its media and journalism institutions. On the other hand, the participants of social media by ordinary Chinese people are permitted by government. Can we regard this phenomenon as discursive strategy in terms of non-official communication by China's current policy? So I think what Kang Yan is speaking here is about domestic Chinese media politics, whereby on one hand, there's control over various institutions. On the other hand, social media participants are often, I think, are actually critiquing the government and participating in all kinds of so-called online events, right? That's very common. I think that in this case, I actually talk about this in my first book, and I discuss this as improvisation as the way to kind of improvise. I call it guarded improvisation, that there's a lot of control, but within this control, there are also small spaces for critique. So I wouldn't call it so much discursive kind of solidarity. I would call it more, I think, guarded improvisation in this case, because that comes from my earlier work, whereby social media participants, critical journalists have small bubbles of spaces to critique some official policies within the overall environment that's extremely controlled. The next comment is from Florence Madenga. She says, I'm hoping to follow up with you on a point about the racialized terms used by Africans, Ethiopians to describe those from China and vice versa. Are there ways in which people are using Amharic terms for this, in which they are also co-opting Western stereotypes in similar ways that the Chinese terms are appropriating racist ideas of Africans' Black bodies? I know this happens in other contexts on the continent, but echoing Kimberly on whether this can be generalizable. So yes, that's a great question. And I think some of the kind of ways in which Chinese are being perceived, perhaps they do echo some of the discussions we see also in the West. I mean, some of the very crude ways also concern, I think, just very basic accusations or kind of against mixed marriages, or this idea of mixed race. But I think a lot of it in the case of Ethiopia comes from its very specific history. Ethiopia was not, fully colonized. They're very proud of their sovereignty, and they want to kind of contain this independence. And they are really worried about China is incurring on this kind of space, not only in terms of its investments and loans, but also in terms of mixing with Ethiopians. One of the themes that came up in my research was just this really dire position to mixed marriages, mixed relationships, and the children that come out of these relationships being laughed at, being criticized, and so forth. So I see this as more of something that's grounded in Ethiopia's history and reality than something that's imported maybe from the West. But I am learning Amharic, so I'm hoping to return to Ethiopia next summer to pursue this in more detail, because I agree with you, we need to have those terms to unpack these kind of stereotypes deeper. What sort of terms are they using, and how similar are they to those used in English? So that's something that I'm actually planning to delve into deeper next time. So thank you for this suggestion. Next question is from Angela Wu. Could you elaborate more on avoiding romanticizing the notion of the global South, especially how the complex interaction between Ethiopia and China informs us to further think through the notion of global South? And what do you think of some recent arguments that China does not belong to the global South due to implicit political and economic reasons? So Angela always has amazing questions. Thank you so much for putting them out there. So first of all, delving deeper into this idea of how do we de-romanticize the global South? How does this complex interaction informs us? How do we think about it? So I think one way to that I was thinking about it is that it's just as important to look at the unequal nature of the relationships within the global South and the frictions as it is to look at the different forms of friendships, right, that are forming. Because I think that only by looking at those frictions, we can kind of really start taking this seriously, because undoubtedly, not only China and Ethiopia, but China with any country, I think in the global South, carries really multifaceted ties, whether it's even something like India, which is kind of a competitor of similar size and power, or a less powerful country like Ethiopia. So I think starting from kind of the ground up and thinking about these interactions, not just in simplistic forms of, okay, what kind of relationship is this, but also what is the difference between elite and public layer, and what do these frictions tell us about China's reach, this kind of relations. I think the frictions or the disjunctures, I think that's the most interesting part in my sort of thinking about this project. It's not so much about what it does do, but maybe some things that don't match up or don't connect are the most fascinating to me. And it's in terms of the China's belonging to the global South or not belonging, I think it's an interesting question. It kind of, I think, ties to the idea of, is China a developing country, right? Many people might say it's not. It's the second world largest economy. It's about to overtake the US. How is this a developing country? So two thoughts on that. I mean, first of all, China itself continues to see itself as part of the global South and as a developing country. It's a convenient rhetoric for China because it puts it into kind of the equal ground, right, on equal ground with other developing countries, as opposed to being superior or speaking at Africa. It actually wants to appear as if it's speaking with them, even though the events that I highlighted in the beginning don't seem to really work so well in terms of this interaction. But we do see this idea that the rhetoric, the discourse of the global South is used very, I think, ambitiously and strategically by Chinese government. They're often pushed in this idea that when are you going to stop being a developing country? The response they say was that we still have enormous poverty in rural regions. We're still developing. So I don't see them giving up on this anytime soon, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there is, again, kind of significant inequality in terms of geopolitical power within the global South. Arguably, China is very far from Ethiopia when it comes to kind of being on equal standing with almost any country. I mean, it's incredibly powerful. And how it deals with this power, how it acknowledges it without sort of falling back into the same tropes of the West, how does it deal with becoming an overpowering actor in the region? That's something I think that's to watch as we move along in this research, as well as with the news that keep coming about China and Africa. The next question is from Bilge. How do we theorize global South in light of this soft power, PD activities and North-South, South-South solidarities? Can soft power theories developed with the West in mind can be of help? Sorry, I meant can be of any help, sorry. Or do we need to look elsewhere? Well, I hope that one of the kind of takeaways of this project is that we do need to theorize soft power from the perspective of other participants, other major powers like China. I think that taking Joseph Nye's concept that essentially suggests that American values of, freedom, democracy, and so forth are universal. That's actually what he's arguing. American values are universally attractive. So if China doesn't have those values, it's doomed to failure, right? The idea that anybody who's not America, who's not a Western democracy, will never score high on his sophisticated rankings of soft power. I think that's highly problematic because, as we see here, even though China's relations and approach to Africa yields mixed solidarities, it is attracting a lot of people to participate and at least try to engage with China. This attraction is not built on liberal values. It's not even built on authoritarian values. It's actually built on gifts or offerings or the kind of material advantages that it brings, the empowerment that happens on a daily basis. So I think what we need to think about as part of Global South research is to theorize and think about soft power from the perspective of various participants that are engaged in it, especially those major countries like you were studying, Turkey or China or Russia. How do they define soft power? I know that in Russia, they also have a very different vision of it. They have their own perception. So how do we think about it from their angle? So that's something that I think is a significant step that I hope to also collaborate with you on. I know you're working on this topic as well. The next question is from John Jackson. I really appreciated listening to you describe this global transnational dynamics with such conceptual nuance and empirical specificity. Oh, he has to log off, so there's no question. Never mind. Well, thank you for that. And I guess that's all. There's no more questions.
Yeah, and it's 1 o'clock on the dot, so I guess it's the end of the the official proceedings of this. As Marina just noted in the chat, we're happy to keep the meeting open for a more kind of informal discussion. But this is we want to first thank you very much for this fascinating talk. We can't wait for the book and to read the book. That's amazing. So thank you so much. And yes, we'll keep this open for another 15 minutes, just as we would in a normal room where people can sort of more informally mingle and continue, discussing the topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. If anybody has any extra questions, I'm
exactly
here.
Yeah. A lot of messages and a lot of thank yous. No, this is it's really amazing. I mean, I'm really curious. There's a few things that I was actually thinking. Sorry, I'm just going to keep talking and asking questions. What is the role of other countries? Because you mentioned kind of how, you know, China is positioning itself against, you know, kind of Western countries, the US in particular. What is the role of other maybe newcomers like Turkey and Ethiopia? Are they kind of trying to make moves as in other places in Africa, which I know they have? So
yeah, I mean, Turkey is definitely coming into Africa also with full force. There's a lot of construction projects and other types of economic engagements, but I haven't seen too much. I mean, on the cultural frontier, that's state-sponsored. I've seen Turkish soap operas, so kind of the non-official soft power is actually pretty strong. So if you enter public space, whether it's a gym or some other kind of space you're building, the TV is on, you're very likely to see Turkish soap opera as opposed to CGTN, Chinese television station, or Russia Today, right? Those don't seem to make it into the popular stream. And there's a really fascinating new TV initiative in Ethiopia called Kana TV that translates or kind of puts subtitles onto soap operas and popular kind of entertainment content and transmits that to Ethiopian viewers. And they tell me that Turkish content is one of the most popular. So they rate what people like, and then they create subtitles. So when I asked them about China, they said, well, we don't have any indication that Chinese popular culture is going to get high ratings, so we're not going to translate it. This is kind of like, it's a commercial firm. It's sort of a commercial TV project, and very fancy building. They're doing all this work, and they're making a lot of money from Turkish soap operas. So there's this really interesting kind of angle there. But state-sponsored, which is what I was looking here, China is much less present. I think there's only one Turkish institute in Ethiopia, and it's run by one Turkish individual. So it's very small operation.
No, that's great. Yeah, and if you, I guess, if people have questions, can they raise their hand? Can we unmute them to keep this more? If I don't know.
There's one question I see here about Ghana. Kimberly Naronha, she says, I study Ghana in my research, and I wondered if you could compare views about Africa and China regionally, West Africa versus East Africa versus MENA versus South Africa. So that's a very global project. My research tends to dive deeper into one context as opposed to going too much kind of outwards, because I'm afraid to make, you know, too many generalizations, since I don't do the field work in Ghana, and I would love to visit, but that's not a place where I've done my field work. But I think that's, you know, one thing that comes to mind is that in West Africa, in general, with kind of much stronger influence from former colonial powers like France, there's actually much more competition in some ways when it comes to soft power initiatives, because a lot of the content and the language, it takes a lot more barriers, I think, to reach out to the public. But also, I think the discussions or kind of differences can be also formed around the type of political system we're dealing with. For example, Kenya, of course, is in East Africa, but the kind of critiques that are published in Kenyan press are much more explicit about China. There are investigations, there are all sorts of humorous articles, satire, art. It's coming out of Kenya, it's not coming out of Ethiopia. And the difference here is not regional. The difference here is in terms of Kenya being a much more liberal, right, political system with really vibrant civil society that contests China at every level. In Ethiopia, the civil society is hardly kind of present. The regime is in transition into kind of a vulnerable democracy, and we don't see a whole lot of space for kind of tackling China, investigating China. But most of the really interesting voices I see, they come from more liberal political systems where they can actually publicize this and have resources to investigate. So I think that's kind of where I see the big distinction. Bill Gates saying that Turkey is harping on Muslim identity in its soft power initiatives in Africa. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a very strong point for Turkey, because China has a hard time appealing with kind of through it, you know, just any kind of simple cultural sort of drive or direction, because the culture it promotes is Confucius cultures, right? It's ancient culture. It's about, you know, Tai Chi, it's about all kinds of, you know, paper cutting, scissors, and so forth. Everybody who's been to China have seen these various traditional forms. And when I attended some of these events, it was very funny that, you know, people are really bored often and they kind of pretending to like it. And then I spoke to somebody from Chinese embassy who said, this is not even our culture. Like, we don't practice this. We don't drink tea out of this, you know, special pots. We just drink it out of a normal mug. And we don't really do paper cutting, scissors, and we don't do any of these things. Like, this is not our culture. It's old, but we don't have the new one. We don't know how to introduce the new modern culture. So there is no religious dimension there. And I think Turkey's religious dimension is channel is very powerful in comparison to kind of China trying to, you know, seduce through material means, but then beyond that, it's very hard to find the deeper foundation. That's something that I guess plays into Turkish favor here. I wonder if you could speak a little more about the fragmented part of the fragmented spectacle. How does this differ from previous forms of soft power? This is Lauren Bridges. Well, the thing that I really highlight here in terms of the fragmented part of the spectacle is the fragmented, essentially the kind of layered but also contested solidarities that this form of soft power ends up yielding. So what's different with other descriptions of soft power is that actually soft power, that as we know it from the American lens, talks very little about the types of relationships that it creates. It talks more about success or failure. Do people like China or not like China? If you go to Ethiopia and do a public opinion survey with Pew firm or any other firm, you'll see that the reaction is going to be maybe quite positive. But why is that? People are afraid to say negative things. They don't know what the survey means. You're going to get an overwhelmingly positive response. But if you look beneath that survey of public opinion, you'll see very different types of relations. So I think what I'm hinting at here is that it's really significant to look at this in relational terms. And that brings us to a very different story than what we see from public opinion polls. And that's the fragmented part of this spectacle, is what kind of relationships it actually yields. Florence Madenga, I'm wondering how soft China's soft power really is. When thinking about soft power, I mostly think movies, entertainment, culture, food, and the things you mentioned seem quite administrative, even within the Confucius centers. Wondering if there are degrees of softness in the soft power framework. Well, I think what you are kind of coming at when it comes to soft power is, I think you are actually adopting sort of the Western kind of lens of culture as being separate right from the state, that this idea that it's about the popular culture, it's about the films, it's about the food. China tends to promote itself as kind of deliberately as fusing this sort of the material, the administrative with culture. So it's almost hard to divide them apart. If you're coming for training to China, you will see Chinese, banquets on food, and you'll see various movies. Perhaps you might not enjoy them, but you'll be watching them. So you'll be introduced to various cultural products, but at the same time, you're also very much introduced to China's economic development story. So the two are very much kind of fused together. That's China's approach. They see that as soft. And in fact, the way they conceptualize soft power is cultural soft power, which is kind of ironic because there's not as much culture in there as there is other, stuff that I've gone over in this talk. But they see themselves as, having this cultural soft power. But culture, in this case, the way that it's being treated analytically is not so much just popular culture. It's about the success of the developmental kind of miracle. It's about the China story and a model for other nations. So culture is a much broader kind of idea. That's the way it's described by Chinese officials. It's almost impossible to narrow it down to a particular channel. That's how Chinese scholars themselves see Chinese cultural soft power. Omar Al-Ghazi is here. Hi, Omar. The question of Islam is interesting because to an extent, China was shielded in the Muslim world from criticisms over its treatment of its Muslims as compared to boycott campaigns against France, for instance. This comes into a very, I think, sensitive and terrifying territory of Xinjiang, and where China continues to separate families and to bring Uyghurs into various labor camps. And I don't know how recent this is now, but my mind is still quite recent. There was a big letter that was signed by a number of countries, including those practicing Muslim religion in Africa, but also in the wider Arab world, that supported China. They actually said China is not doing anything illicit. And they gathered something like 36 votes or signatures to contest the signatures that were gathered from elsewhere. So this definitely kind of speaks to the more sharp power or angle. We can call it sharp power. We can call it kind of strategic power. That's some of these initiatives yield, is that one has to also, I think, anticipate that these countries may vote in favor of China, whether it's when it comes to its grotesque human rights violations or when it comes to votes at the UN. It seems that that's kind of a really significant part of the success, right? But of course, they wouldn't frame it this way. They would never talk about it this way if they were the ones explaining the story. But that's the outcome that seems to be present. Titan Belt, Rocky Road. Yes, maybe they should change it to this, Belt and Road, instead of Titan Belt, Rocky Road. Turkey did not sign that letter, by the way. Yeah, I've seen that. Turkey was speaking out against it, but many other countries have. Oh. All right. Any other questions?
All right. I think that's...
Everything is just too clear, I guess. Okay.
Yeah, this is just a lot to think about, and a lot of food for thought. Since we're on the topic of ice cream, we're going to keep going with food. I think maybe it's lunchtime.
Overbearing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks
very much.
everyone for attending the event.
Great.
Yeah, fascinating.
Is it possible to save the questions? I just wanted to later.
Yes, we get all the files so we can share that with you afterwards.
I think many of them will help me in my writing of the project that's currently very much in progress. So.
All right. So this is what you're doing this year at the Wilson Center, then mostly.
Yeah, so I'm finishing a shorter book that's due in a few weeks, China's Global Soft Power. It's like a state of the field book, which helped me actually see how much or how little has been done on the subject from different perspectives. And now I'm writing this book here this year. So it's a full year to focus on that, and also to do some elite ethnography. Mostly, unfortunately, it's going to be Zoom because our numbers of COVID are going up. So it's talking to different officials and policy thinkers who are basically getting grants and making money from this China-Africa issue. They're trying to strategically use this opportunity to kind of create alliances, but also to create this kind of new purpose that we're fighting China as this moral enemy. So I'm very interested in this idea of morality and how it gets kind of thought through by these policymakers, and how they get their resources, and who from Africa do they invite, from which countries, which kind of leaders support this narrative. So I'm looking at that as one of the chapters in the book. So
these are people in
yeah, people in DC who there are now several kind of programs devoted to China in the world, and a lot of it focuses on Africa, including in the State Department. They have now a person in Nairobi from the US Embassy whose entire job is to watch China. So it's interesting that there's this kind of, again, kind of reminiscent a bit of I think the Cold War spirit, but it's not quite the same scale. And I think they don't know nearly as much about China as the Americans used to know in the Soviet, or kind of the area of the Cold War, where they really studied it. Now it's sort of more imaginative, but it's interesting.
It's also funny how it says Bill Gates raised hand.
Oh.
Unmute. Let me see if I can unmute.
Oh, I see Bill Gates. I don't see her image, but just the name.
I'm not sure.
I tried to unmute her, but I don't know.
Yeah, I can't either. I'm not sure.
When I was speaking, I had like little things pop up of people entering the room.
Yes.
I was like, oh God, I don't know if I'm supposed to click on anything. So I just like,
we handled it.
It's weird how these things play out.
Yeah, that's really
that's amazing.
Unexpected sometimes.
Yeah, the other thing you mentioned that was fascinating is that, the kind of spontaneous kind of encounter. And you mentioned that specifically in China, kind of the more informal ways, kind of non-native people meet. But I'm wondering how that plays out in Ethiopia too. Because I know, and it's probably different in Ethiopia, but I know in Guinea, like the Chinese work, that same rumor is in Guinea is everywhere, that, these are like prison labor that they come. But part of it, I think maybe is that they tend to live in compounds and they don't really come out a lot. And there's not a lot of spaces where people interact more informally outside of, these work.
Yeah, there are very few spaces for that. So this is really, I think the difference is that in China, there are actually more spaces, because if you're living there for years, and if you're a journalist, you will encounter a lot of, different types of Chinese people just by virtue of like your regular life there. But if you are in Ethiopia, Chinese communities are separate. I mean, if you think about Confucius Institutes, it's supposed to be kind of full of, younger teachers. They might be able to experience more of the city, but they are told to come home usually by 5 p.m. They have rules, and they're not supposed to interact with anybody outside of the center. Kind of to create this personal ties is actually considered to be somewhat not illegal, but it's discouraged. So they don't hang out much outside of their spaces. They really spend most of their time with themselves, making meals on their own, not eating local food. There are a few exceptions. I've met a couple of teachers who are really excited about injera, and they really loved the cafeteria, and they had a few friends, but those were exceptional kind of individuals. The rest were just sticking to their own communities, and not to mention kind of, I think, people who work at various companies. Their job is really has really long hours, and they eat there, they sleep there, they celebrate things there. Everything is in that space. And I think Miriam Dresen, I saw that she was on the call, she wrote a fascinating book about Chinese construction workers in Ethiopia, and she describes this in a lot of detail about their conception of time, their dreams, their ambitions, and also kind of their isolation. So she has written a lot about this sort of community of these workers who build the cement roads and how they spend their time there. And so that's something I would really recommend for thinking about those encounters.
Yeah, I'm gonna check it out. All right. Thanks so much.
Okay, I guess we reached 1:15.
Yeah, 1:15 now. No, thanks so much.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hope we can